Hello and welcome. I'm Barkha Dutt, and any moment now, the Foreign Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj will be taking the stage at the United Nations General Assembly. Those are pictures of her arriving in New York earlier today. She will be, of course, keenly watched. She's at the United Nations, I beg your pardon, she's at the United Nations where she will be addressing the General Assembly any moment now. In the next few minutes, we will be cutting across live to that speech. It's going to be watched not just by India and everybody in Pakistan, but in fact the world. People will be looking to see how she rebuts Nawaz Sharif, a speech that has been widely criticized because it chose to eulogize Hizbul Mujahideen terrorist Burhan Wani, forgetting that Burhan Wani on his tapes actually calls for a caliphate in Kashmir and for jihad. This is going to be a very, very important speech, but India has already replied emphatically to the Pakistan Prime Minister's speech by calling Pakistan the Ivy League of global terrorism. So we'll be going across to Sushma Swaraj in a moment from now. Meanwhile, from New York to New Delhi, here in Delhi, the Prime Minister, let's move to those shots please, the Prime Minister has chaired a meeting to review the Indus Water Treaty. There has been some talk even from former union ministers like Yashwant Sinha to scrap this World Bank mediated water sharing treaty. Today the government took a tough position. The Prime Minister was quoted at this meeting as having said that the flow of blood and water cannot go together. But what was decided at the end of it all? The treaty won't be scrapped, but India will be pushing to maximize what is legally our right. Now remember, this treaty is an 80% to 20% division of waters of the western rivers as they are called. We're talking about the sharing of the Indus River basin, and India has not yet even maximized 20% the use that we're entitled to of the water, because every time India builds a dam or a hydroelectric project, Pakistan drags it into international arbitration. And that is something that India has decided now at a meeting chaired by the Prime Minister to take a tough position on. That quote capturing the essence of that meeting: blood and water cannot flow together. So the decision to maximize potential, but potential that is legally ours, and also to divert water to Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, can we bring up that graphic, please? Let's start looking at some of the main decisions that were taken at this meeting. As we've said, we do know now that Indus Water Commission talks will be suspended as long as terror continues to be an issue. Maximum potential of these waters is going to be looked at by India. In fact, India will aim to use the water to generate 18,000 megawatts of power. There is a decision to expedite 3 dams along the Chenab River. Waiting for those graphics, please. Can we please bring them up? All right, let's stay on those pictures now. There is also a decision to divert water to irrigate 6 lakh hectares in Jammu and Kashmir, and the halted Tulbul power project could be resumed. So more on the Indus Water Treaty and what was decided by the Prime Minister at that meeting, where he said blood and water cannot flow together. In a moment, like we said, we'll be cutting across live to the United Nations General Assembly, where Sushma Swaraj is scheduled to speak any moment now. Let's introduce our guests in the meantime. We are joined by Ambassador Rajiv Dogra, senior diplomat. With me in the studio, Air Marshal P.S. Ahluwalia, who's been of course, the former Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief of the Western Air Command as well as the Southern Command, and has of course seen action in Kargil and led some of those air assaults at that time. Dhruv Jaishankar from the Brookings Institute, Ashok Malik, senior journalist, author and commentator, Seshadri Chari will be with us in a moment. We're standing by for Sushma Swaraj to speak. But let me start with you, Ambassador Dogra. When we're looking at the direction that meeting chaired by the Prime Minister on the Indus Water Treaty has taken, this very, very strong quote from the Prime Minister: the flow of blood and water cannot go together. But in effect, the status quo in terms of not abrogating the treaty, there is going to be no abrogation. Instead, the government has decided to maximize potential. How do you read this development?
Well, before the Prime Minister's meeting, the Pakistani Senate last week passed a resolution asking for a revision of the treaty. So they are one step ahead of us. But Prime Minister's meeting, unfortunately, there was a lot of media hype, or expectations were built up that maybe after the meeting, India would announce abrogation of the treaty. That was not on the cards, and that should not have been on the cards, for the simple reason that India has not even utilized what is its legitimate due even in that unequal treaty of 1960. So it is going to be a long haul even utilizing those waters, because these works take a long time to actually come into life. So I think at the moment it is an exercise in determining what can be done and hopefully how speedily it can be done. If it was a message to Pakistan, I don't think it was a very effective message.
Let me bring in Ashok at this point. Ambassador Dogra skeptical. You in one of your columns said that all talk of abrogation is cuckoo land talk, it's television studio talk. But in some ways the government has added heft to this narrative by this very, very strong quote from the Prime Minister of blood and water not flowing together. But yes, it's quite clear that we're not talking of abrogation, Ashok. But what we are looking to do is to maximize the 20% of water that we are allowed to use that we don't fully utilize. This strong statement, blood and water cannot flow together. How do we read this messaging? Ambassador Dogra skeptical of how strongly it will go down in Pakistan.
No, Ambassador Dogra is skeptical of how quickly the projects can actually be built, and he's completely right.
Because it will take years. It will take years. There's no immediate consequence.
But I don't think Ambassador Dogra is against the idea of these projects being considered and some sort of a process of building these projects starting. Because we have not built these projects all these years. We have been generous with Pakistan. We have been oversensitive to Pakistan's concerns, or sometimes concerns which are not really valid. And each time we come up with a suggestion for a project, they go to the arbitration authority, or they come up with some sort of an objection. So if Mr. Modi and the government are indicating that this time they are serious and they will go ahead, whether Pakistan comes up with some excuse or the other, then I think that's perfectly valid and justified, and I hope to stay the course. I'm glad a full-fledged abrogation as well being advocated by some people, including somebody wrote a column last week. Mr. Yashwant Sinha said something which I was quite surprised by. A full-fledged abrogation which would have been a problem, and I'm glad the government didn't go down that route. But working within the legal parameters of the Indus Waters Treaty and trying to get what we deserve, what we are entitled to, what our people are entitled to in Jammu and Kashmir and elsewhere is perfectly valid, and I hope the government stays the course and goes ahead and does it now.
Imashal Ahluwalia, water is a weapon. You know, I have heard this proposal in the past in some of the worst years in the Kashmir Valley. It's actually never happened. The government has certainly stopped short of using it as a weapon. To maximize what is legally yours is certainly something that nobody in the world can object to. There is also the China factor when it comes to the treaty. The Indus River originates in China. The Satluj flow can be diverted from China as well. There is the Brahmaputra River. So beyond this very strong statement from the Prime Minister, the meeting he chaired today, attended by the Foreign Secretary and the National Security Advisor, among others, how do we see this development with so much focus on the Indus Water Treaty?
Well, just like you mentioned, Barka, that water can be a very potent and a very lethal weapon, not only now, but certainly in the future. And therefore, what they have done, I think, is very legitimate, very logical, which they haven't done for so many years. And that is 20% of the Indus waters that are supposed to be utilized by India have not been done. 80% is supposed to, of the western rivers,
yes,
go to Pakistan. But
which is Jhelum, Chenab and Indus, yes.
That's right. But what we could have done was to take what is legitimately ours, that's 20% of that, and use it in J&K.
But there is also international arbitration to contend with. So when you break down, and this is what Ambassador Dogra was talking about, if there is an immediate sort of consequence that we're looking for post-Uri, this signals intent, this signals toughening, but there isn't going to be a concretized immediate consequence to this.
No,
because even to expedite dams could take years.
It will take years, and not only that, you've got to have a system of canals. Otherwise, there'll be flooding wherever you go.
Yes.
So therefore, the integrated dams, canals that have to be there will take many years to come up. If you want to make dams, like they're saying, we'll start work on those 3 dams on the Chenab. As and when it comes up, it will another 2 or 3 years. But China factor is another thing, because China, the Indus basin, 6% is in China. We can use Afghanistan. Afghanistan still has, I think, 3% of the Indus thing. About 47% is with Pakistan, and about 37, 38, somewhere there, is with India.
Yeah.
So therefore, what they have done, I think, today, the announcement is that what they should have done many years ago.
Okay, sir, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, Dhruv. Before we could come to you, we can see Sushma Swaraj walking up to take position at the United Nations General Assembly. This is an extremely important speech. This is coming after India described Pakistan to be the Ivy League of global terrorism, but she is expected to rebut Nawaz Sharif. Let's listen in.
नमस्कार
Good morning.
महोदया,
Honorable President,
पहले तो मैं अपनी ओर से और अपने देश की ओर से
on behalf of
श्री
India
पीटर थॉमसन
and
जी
on
को
my own behalf,
इस 71वें अधिवेशन की अध्यक्षता करने के लिए चुने जाने पर बधाई देती और इसके साथ ही श्री बान की मून जी, जो संयुक्त राष्ट्र संघ के महासचिव के तौर पर जिन्होंने सेवाएं की हैं, उनको धन्यवाद देती हूँ। अध्यक्ष जी, 1 वर्ष पहले मैंने इसी पवित्र मंच से अंतर्राष्ट्रीय समुदाय के सदस्यों को संबोधित किया था। तब से लेकर आज तक विश्व में बहुत परिवर्तन हुआ है, कुछ अच्छा, कुछ बुरा और कुछ बहुत चिंता देने वाला। ये एक मंच है जहां हम तमाम घटनाक्रमों पर चर्चा करते हैं, आज भी करेंगे, लेकिन चर्चा करते समय ये ज़रूर देखेंगे कि समीक्षा उन कामों की भी हो जो हमने किए हैं और समीक्षा उन कामों की भी हो जो हम नहीं कर पाए हैं। अध्यक्ष जी, इस गरिमामय महासभा में अनेक मुद्दों पर चर्चा हुई है, जैसे AMR के लिए नए टीकों को साझा करना, सस्ती दवाइयों की उपलब्धता को सुनिश्चित करना, प्राकृतिक आपदाओं के जोखिम को कम करने के लिए सैंडई ढांचे को लागू करना, मानव संसाधनों को मुक्त और सुरक्षित आवागमन सुनिश्चित करना और UN पीस कीपिंग फोर्स में सैनिक भेजने वाले देशों के साथ विचार विमर्श करना। समय के अभाव के कारण मैं इन मुद्दों को नहीं दोहराना चाहूँगी, लेकिन कुछ ऐसे मुद्दों का उल्लेख ज़रूर करना चाहूँगी जो अंतर्राष्ट्रीय समुदाय के लिए अत्यंत महत्वपूर्ण हैं। अध्यक्ष जी, आज हमारे सामने सबसे बड़ी चुनौती है विश्व के कोने कोने में फैली हुई गरीबी को मिटाना और ये सुनिश्चित करना कि हम सभी ज़रूरतमंद लोगों तक समृद्धि पहुंचा सकें। हमें ये भी सुनिश्चित करना है कि स्त्रियों और पुरुषों के बीच लैंगिक समानता हो और महिलाओं को सुरक्षा मिले। हम विश्व शांति के लिए कार्य करना है, क्योंकि शांति के बिना समृद्धि नहीं आ सकती। श्री पीटर थॉमसन इसलिए अभिनंदन के पात्र हैं क्योंकि उन्होंने इन्हीं चुनौतियों के महत्व को समझते हुए इस महासभा के लिए सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट गोल्स यानी टिकाऊ विकास के लक्ष्य को सबसे उच्च प्राथमिकता दी है। 17 लक्ष्य हैं, 2030 तक का एजेंडा, लेकिन मुझे आपको कहते हुए खुशी है कि मात्र 2 साल में ही इन 17 में से अधिकतर लक्ष्यों को भारत सरकार ने अपने राष्ट्रीय कार्यक्रमों में शामिल कर लिया है। सैनिटेशन यानी स्वच्छता, उसके अंतर्गत हमने स्वच्छ भारत अभियान छेड़ा है, जिसके अंतर्गत 2 लाख विद्यालयों में 4 लाख शौचालय बनकर तैयार हो गए हैं और काम कर रहे हैं। इसी तरह जेंडर इक्वालिटी, उसके नीचे बेटी बचाओ बेटी पढ़ाओ एक देशव्यापी अभियान बन गया है और महिलाओं ने इसका बीड़ा अपने सर पर उठाया है। हमारे यहाँ लाखों लाख जनप्रतिनिधि महिलाएं चुनकर आई हुई हैं, वो स्वयं इस अभियान को आगे बढ़ा रही हैं। मेक इन इंडिया, जिसका आह्वान प्रधानमंत्री जी ने किया है, उसके कारण विदेशी पूंजी निवेश भी आ रहा है और हमारे अपने बच्चों को रोजगार भी मिल रहा है। एक और बड़ी योजना गरीबों के लिए, जनधन योजना, ये विश्व की सबसे बड़ी वित्तीय समावेशी योजना है। इसके अंतर्गत 25 करोड़ से ज़्यादा गरीब लोगों के बैंक खाते खोले गए हैं। डिजिटल इंडिया बहुत तेजी से अपने पैर पसार रहा है। भारतीय युवाओं को कौशल युक्त बनाने के लिए अनेकानेक प्रशिक्षण कार्यक्रम चल रहे हैं, जिनसे हमारे युवा अपनी क्षमताओं का समुचित विकास कर सकेंगे। इस तरह की पहलों से भारत की विकास यात्रा में नए आयाम जुड़े हैं और आज आर्थिक मंदी के दौर में भी भारत विश्व की बड़ी अर्थव्यवस्थाओं में सबसे तेजी से विकास करने वाली अर्थव्यवस्था बन गया है। अध्यक्ष जी, हम सब जानते हैं कि मानवता का 1/6 हिस्सा भारत में रहता है। इसलिए यदि भारत में सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट गोल्स, ये टिकाऊ विकास लक्ष्य सफल होंगे तभी विश्व में सफल हो सकेंगे। हम एजेंडा 2030 को पूरे मनोयोग से लागू करने के लिए प्रतिबद्ध हैं। हमने तय किया है कि संसद के हर सत्र में एक दिन केवल एसडीजीज पर हम चर्चा किया करेंगे ताकि इनकी प्रगति पर सतत निगरानी रखी जा सके, और मुझे विश्वास है कि इससे बहुत ही अच्छे परिणाम सामने आएंगे। एजेंडा 2030 को सफल बनाने के लिए वैसे तो सभी देश अपनी अपनी सामर्थ्य के अनुसार कार्य कर रहे हैं, लेकिन मैं ये कहना चाहूँगी कि उन्हें अंतर्राष्ट्रीय सहयोग भी मिलता रहेगा तो वो भी इसमें और ज़्यादा सफलता प्राप्त करेंगे। अध्यक्ष जी, मैं दूसरा विषय ले रही हूँ जलवायु परिवर्तन का। जलवायु परिवर्तन एक और ऐसा मुद्दा है जो हमारे सामने एक गंभीर चुनौती बनकर खड़ा है। प्रकृति के पास संपदा तो अपार है, लेकिन उतनी ही जितनी वो मनुष्य की ज़रूरत को पूरा कर सके, इतनी नहीं कि वो उसके लालच का पेट भर सके, क्योंकि लोभ की तो कोई सीमा नहीं होती। इसीलिए हमारे यहाँ हमारे प्रधानमंत्री जी ने एक सिद्धांत दिया है, क्लाइमेट जस्टिस, जलवायु न्याय। और हम ये मानते हैं कि अगर प्रकृति के साथ हम न्याय करें तो वो हमारे और हमारी भावी पीढ़ियों के साथ न्याय करेगी, लेकिन यदि हम उसका अंधाधुंध दोहन करेंगे तो वो क्रोधित हो जाएगी और अपना रौद्र रूप दिखाएगी। हम देख रहे हैं दुनिया में कई जगह पर प्रकृति अप्राकृतिक हो उठी है। कहीं भयंकर वर्षा, कहीं घनघोर गर्मी, कहीं झंझावात, कहीं सुनामी, कहीं बादलों का फटना। ये समय का तकाजा है कि अब हम असीमित खपत पर रोक लगाएं और अपनी जीवन शैली को पर्यावरण के अनुकूल बनाएं। योग इसका एक बड़ा माध्यम बन सकता है। योग भारत का वो प्राचीन ज्ञान है जो एक टिकाऊ जीवन शैली का प्रतीक है। पिछले 2 वर्षों से अंतर्राष्ट्रीय योग दिवस के लिए जो अपार समर्थन आप सबसे मिल रहा है, मैं आज इस मंच से आप सबके प्रति आभार व्यक्त करती हूँ। अध्यक्ष जी, पेरिस समझौते में कॉमन बट डिफरेंशिएटेड रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज विद रिस्पेक्टिव कैपेसिटीज के सिद्धांत को स्वीकारा गया है, जिसका अर्थ है कि जिम्मेदारी तो सबकी साझी है, लेकिन देनदारी सबकी अलग अलग। इसलिए यह बेहद ज़रूरी है कि विकसित देश अपनी जिम्मेदारियों का निर्वहन करते हुए सभी की भलाई के लिए तकनीक भी दें और धनराशि दें, तभी ये कार्यक्रम सफल होगा। हमने अपने देश में बहुत महत्वाकांक्षी योजना बनाई है, जिसमें हमने वर्ष 2030 तक 40% ऊर्जा नॉन फॉसिल फ्यूल से बनाने का लक्ष्य रखा है। इसके लिए हमें एक निश्चित वातावरण की आवश्यकता होगी, क्योंकि बाहर से पूंजी निवेश करने वालों को वातावरण की निश्चिंतता चाहिए, और हम इस प्रयास में लगे हुए हैं। इसके अलावा इंटरनेशनल सोलर अलायंस का गठन भी हमारी एक अभिनव पहल है, जिससे सौर तकनीक सभी को उपलब्ध हो सकेगी। मैं इस मंच से ये विश्वास दिलाती हूँ कि जलवायु परिवर्तन की दिशा में भारत एक अग्रणी भूमिका निभाएगा। और मुझे आपको खुशी है ये बताते हुए कि हमने निर्णय किया है कि पेरिस समझौते के लिए भारत अपना इंस्ट्रूमेंट ऑफ रेटिफिकेशन 2 अक्टूबर को जमा करा देगा। और ये स्थिति हमने सोच समझकर चुनी है, क्योंकि 2 अक्टूबर गांधी जी का जन्म दिवस है, जिनका संपूर्ण जीवन प्रकृति के संरक्षण को ही समर्पित रहा। अध्यक्ष जी, अब मैं एक ऐसे विषय पर बोलने जा रही हूँ जिस पर इस सभा में बैठा हर व्यक्ति चिंतित है, और चिंतित नहीं सोचने पर मजबूर है। इसी महीने इस शहर में हुए 9/11 आतंकी हमले की 15वीं वर्षगांठ थी। पिछले 15 दिनों में इसी शहर में एक और आतंकी हमले में मासूमों को मारने की कोशिश की गई थी। हम इस शहर के दर्द को समझते हैं। हम पर भी उरी में इन्हीं आतंकी ताकतों ने हमला किया था। विश्व इस अभिशाप से बहुत समय से जूझ रहा है, लेकिन आतंकवाद का शिकार हुए मासूमों के खून और आंसुओं के बावजूद इस वर्ष काबुल, ढाका, इस्तांबुल, मोगादिशु, ब्रसेल्स, बैंकॉक, पेरिस, पठानकोट और उरी में हुए आतंकवादी हमले और सीरिया और इराक में रोजमर्रा की बर्बर त्रासदियां हमें ये याद दिलाती हैं कि हम इसे रोकने में सफल नहीं हो रहे। अध्यक्ष जी, यहाँ बैठे सब लोगों को पहले तो एक बार ये स्वीकारना होगा, यदि हम आतंकवाद से लड़ना चाहते हैं तो, कि आतंकवाद मानवाधिकारों का सबसे बड़ा उल्लंघन है। सबसे पहले हम इसे स्वीकारें, आतंकवाद मानवाधिकारों का सबसे बड़ा उल्लंघन है, क्योंकि वो निर्दोष लोगों को निशाना बनाता है, बेगुनाहों को मारता है। वो किसी व्यक्ति या देश का नहीं बल्कि मानवता का अपराधी है। और उसके बाद देखना होगा कि इन आतंकवादियों को पनाह देने वाले कौन कौन हैं। आतंकवादियों का न तो कोई अपना बैंक है, ना हथियारों की फैक्ट्रियां, तो कहां से उन्हें धन मिलता है? कौन इन्हें हथियार देता है? कौन इन्हें सहारा देता है? कौन इन्हें संरक्षण देता है? ऐसे ही सवाल इसी मंच से अफगानिस्तान ने भी कुछ दिन पहले उठाए थे। अध्यक्ष जी, इतिहास गवाह है कि जिस किसी ने भी हिंसक विचारधारा के बीज बोए हैं, उसका कड़वा फल उसे खाने को मिला है। ये छोटे छोटे आतंकवादी समूह जो छिटपुट काम कर रहे थे, आज इन समूहों ने मिलकर एक राक्षस का रूप धारण कर लिया, जिसके अनगिनत हाथ हैं, अनगिनत पांव हैं, अनगिनत दिमाग हैं और साथ में है अति आधुनिक तकनीक। इसलिए अब अपना या पराया, मेरा या दूसरे का आतंकवादी कहकर हम इस जंग को नहीं जीत पाएंगे। पता नहीं ये दैत्य किस समय किस तरफ का रुख कर लेगा। इसलिए यदि हम आतंकवाद को जड़ से उखाड़ना चाहते हैं तो एक ही तरीका है, हम अपने मतभेद भुलाकर आतंकवाद के खिलाफ एकजुट हों, उसका मुकाबला दृढ़ संकल्प से करें और अपने प्रयासों में तेजी लाएं। हमें पुराने समीकरण तोड़ने होंगे, अपनी पसंदगियां नापसंदगियां एक तरफ रखनी होंगी, मोह त्यागने होंगे, एहसानों को भूलना होगा और एक दृढ़ निश्चय के साथ इकट्ठे होकर इस आतंकवाद का सामना करने की रणनीति बनानी होगी। ये मुश्किल काम नहीं है अध्यक्ष महोदय, केवल इच्छा शक्ति की कमी है। ये काम हो सकता है और ये काम हमें करना है। नहीं करेंगे तो हमारी आने वाली संततियां हमें माफ नहीं करेंगी। हाँ, यदि कोई देश इस तरह की रणनीति में शामिल नहीं होना चाहता तो फिर हम उसे अलग थलग कर दें। अगर कोई देश इस तरह की रणनीति में शामिल नहीं होना चाहता तो मेरी मांग है कि हम उसे अलग थलग कर दें, क्योंकि दुनिया में ऐसे देश हैं जो बोते भी हैं तो आतंकवाद, उगाते भी हैं तो आतंकवाद, बेचते भी हैं तो आतंकवाद और निर्यात भी करते हैं तो आतंकवाद। आतंकवादियों को पालना कुछ देशों का शौक बन गया है। ऐसे शौकीन देशों की पहचान करके उनकी जवाबदेही सुनिश्चित की जानी चाहिए और ऐसे देशों को भी चिन्हित करना चाहिए जहां संयुक्त राष्ट्र द्वारा प्रतिबंधित आतंकवादी सरेआम जलसे कर रहे हैं, प्रदर्शन निकालते हैं, जहर उगलते हैं और उनके ऊपर कोई कार्रवाई नहीं होती। इसके लिए उन आतंकवादियों के साथ वे देश भी दोषी हैं जो उन्हें ऐसा करने देते हैं। ऐसे देशों की विश्व समुदाय में कोई जगह नहीं होनी चाहिए। अध्यक्ष जी, 21 तारीख को इसी मंच से पाकिस्तान के प्रधानमंत्री ने भारत के संबंध में 2 बातें कही जिनका जवाब देना चाहूंगी। एक तो उन्होंने कहा कि मेरे देश में मानवाधिकार का उल्लंघन हो रहा है। मैं कहना चाहूंगी कि जिनके अपने घर शीशे के हों उन्हें दूसरों पर पत्थर नहीं फेंकने चाहिए। जरा एक बार बगल में झांक कर देख लें क्या हो रहा है बलूचिस्तान में, और वो खुद क्या कर रहे हैं वहां। मैं कह सकती हूं यहां के आज जो बलूचिस्तान में हो रहा है वो यातनाओं की पराकाष्ठा है। और दूसरी बात उन्होंने कही कि भारत जो शर्तें बातचीत के लिए लगा रहा है वो हमें मंजूर नहीं है। मुझे समझ नहीं रही कौन सी शर्त, किस शर्त की बात की जा रही है। हमारे शपथ ग्रहण समारोह से पहले जब हमने पाकिस्तान के प्रधानमंत्री को समारोह में आने का न्योता दिया था, आमंत्रण दिया था, तो क्या कोई शर्त रखी थी? मैं स्वयं इस्लामाबाद गई थी और कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव बायलैटरल डायलॉग हमने शुरू किया था इकट्ठे बैठकर, क्या कोई शर्त रखी थी? प्रधानमंत्री मोदी काबुल से दिल्ली आते हुए लाहौर उतर गए थे, कोई शर्त लगा कर गए थे क्या? ये कौन सी शर्तों की बात हो रही है? सच्चाई तो यह है अध्यक्ष जी कि शर्तों के आधार पर नहीं, मित्रता के आधार पर हमने पाकिस्तान के साथ सारे के सारे विवाद सुलझाने की पहल की थी, और मित्रता भी सहजता की तरफ जा रही थी। कभी ईद की शुभकामनाएं, कभी क्रिकेट की शुभकामनाएं, कभी स्वास्थ्य के हाल का कुशल क्षेम। हमने 2 बरस में मित्रता का वो पैमाना खड़ा किया जो उससे पहले कभी नहीं था। लेकिन हमें मिला क्या बदले में? पठानकोट, उरी, बहादुर अली। मैं पूछना चाहती हूं, हम शर्तें लगा रहे हैं या आप दूसरी नीयत दिखा रहे हैं? बहादुर अली तो जिंदा सबूत है हमारे पास, जिंदा, कि सीमा पार से आतंकवादी आया है, लिखित में सबूत है हमारे पास उसका। कि मैं एक चीज़ यहाँ बता दूँ, अगर पाकिस्तान ये समझता है कि इस तरह की हरकतें करके या इस तरह के भड़काऊ बयान देकर वो भारत का कोई हिस्सा हमसे छीन सकता है, तो मैं पूरी दृढ़ता और स्पष्टता के साथ यहाँ ये कह देना चाहती हूँ कि आपका ये मंसूबा कभी कामयाब नहीं होगा। कश्मीर भारत का अभिन्न हिस्सा है, जम्मू कश्मीर भारत का अभिन्न हिस्सा है और अभिन्न हिस्सा रहेगा। इसलिए ये ख्वाब देखना छोड़ दें। अध्यक्ष जी, मैंने प्रारंभ में कहा था कि हमने जो काम किए हैं वो तो हम गिनाएंगे ही, जो नहीं किए वो भी गिनाने चाहिए। मैं ऐसे 2 काम गिनाना चाहती हूँ। पहला है CCIT यानी कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव कन्वेंशन ऑन इंटरनेशनल टेररिज्म। सन 1996 से भारत द्वारा ने प्रस्ताव दिया, 20 साल गुजर गए, आज 2016 में भी हम CCIT निष्कर्ष तक नहीं पहुंचा सके। इसी कारण हम कोई ऐसा अंतर्राष्ट्रीय मानक नहीं बना सके हैं जिसके अंतर्गत आतंकवादियों को सजा दी सके या उनका प्रत्यार्पण हो सके। इसीलिए आप सबसे मेरा अनुरोध है कि ये सभा पूरे दृढ़ निश्चय के साथ जल्द CCIT को पारित करें। दूसरी बात, जैसे आतंकवाद से लड़ने के लिए हमें एक समकालीन नीति चाहिए, उसी प्रकार हमें एक ऐसी संयुक्त राष्ट्र सुरक्षा परिषद भी चाहिए जो आज के वैश्विक परिदृश्य के अनुकूल हो। अधिकांश देशों का मानना है कि संयुक्त राष्ट्र 1945 की वैश्विक परिस्थिति के अनुरूप सिर्फ कुछ ही देशों के हितों की रक्षा ना करे, चाहे वो किसी संस्था की बात हो या मुद्दों की। हमें आज की वास्तविकता और चुनौतियों के अनुसार काम करना होगा। आज सुरक्षा परिषद की स्थायी और अस्थायी दोनों सीटों में विस्तार की आवश्यकता है, जिससे सुरक्षा परिषद समकालीन बन सके। मेरा अनुरोध है कि इस आम सभा की इच्छा अनुसार IGN प्रक्रिया जो टेक्स्ट बेस्ड निगोशिएशन शुरू हुई है उसको हम जल्दी प्रारंभ करें। यदि ये दोनों चिर प्रतीक्षित कार्य आपके इस कार्यकाल में हो जाते हैं तो मैं कह सकती हूँ कि संयुक्त राष्ट्र सभा का ये 71वां अधिवेशन बहुत ही सार्थक साबित होगा। अध्यक्ष जी, 21वीं सदी पर शुरुआत से ही अशांति और हिंसा का साया रहा है, परंतु मिलजुल कर प्रयास करने से हम इसे मानव सभ्यता के इतिहास में एक स्वर्णिम युग में बदल सकते हैं। लेकिन भविष्य में क्या होगा ये इस बात पर निर्भर करता है कि हम आज क्या करते हैं। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
I thank the Minister for External Affairs of India for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Vivian Balakrishnan.
All right, that was Sushma Swaraj at the United Nations General Assembly, an address that actually started by focusing on the sustainable development goals, on poverty, on climate change, perhaps in keeping with the comments made by the Prime Minister over the weekend, where he said that the real war has to be a war against poverty and a war and a fight for equality. But towards the end of the speech came the anticipated rebuttal, a scathing rebuttal to Nawaz Sharif. There was the mention that countries who do not join the the fight against terrorism do not belong to the Committee of Nations. There was a strong reference to Balochistan, that when Pakistan talks about human rights violations in India, it should first look in its own backyard and the brutal repression of the Baloch people. And finally, addressing Nawaz Sharif's claim that India had made unreasonable conditions for dialogue, talking about the unconditional warmth of an invite at the Prime Minister's swearing in Delhi, and several other gestures, including an unannounced visit to Lahore that were met with Pathankot, Uri, as well as Bahadur Ali, of course, a terrorist that has been taken prisoner by India. How do we read these comments? We're looking at what happened both in New Delhi and New York. Seshadri Chari is with us. Dhruv Jaishankar is also with us. I had started speaking to others. Mr. Chari, I'll take your first comments. It's an interesting tonality because it doesn't focus too much on Pakistan, except in the end.
I think it was a very good strategy, a very calibrated approach towards what India should take, this kind of stand that India should take. It's little doubt that within India the public outcry is there.
Was this aimed at the Indian domestic constituency or the global stage?
No, I think the first part was obviously addressed to the global community. See, the global community is looking at India as a responsible country, as an important destination for investment.
Yeah.
And they are interested in knowing what you are doing as far as your economy is concerned. They are wanting to know what kind of ease of business proposals that you are going to work out. And they are also looking at issues, however small it may be or insignificant it may be for us. Like, for example, the GST, we could have taken 2 years to settle the GST issue, but the world is looking at the GST issue with a very, very different outlook.
So there was also an attempt to take the high road in a way
that were projected to the world.
Yeah.
And while we are doing all these things, India is suffering, and the setback is only because of terrorism, and terrorism emanating from our neighborhood.
Yeah.
And this terrorism is not located only within India, it's not targeted only within India, it's located in our neighborhood but targeting us. But this terrorism is targeting many other centers of world trade. That is what she mentioned.
And
all
also to
the
locate
places that she said.
And also to locate terrorism within the larger vulnerability to global Islamist violence and terror.
Virtually a call for not only the rest of the world, but especially to those countries which have been looking at Pakistan as a friend and as an ally in fighting terrorism. That is why these two words, I mean, you can get the proper English word, but Samikaran and Ehsas. Forget old Purane Samikaran, she mentioned very specifically, and she said forget Ehsas, Ehsan. Ehsan means
obligation,
some obligation that you have given us because you were with us and we were with us.
Which means Pakistan and what
you helped us in Afghanistan and then did this. You allowed us some economic corridor through your country so that we can reach the Indian Ocean, which the Americans don't want, Indians don't want, but please help us. This kind of reference without naming these two very important countries. The elephant in the room is United States of America and China clearly.
That's interesting, and we'll take a deeper dive into that. But Dhruv, there was also a clear attempt to contrast this with Nawaz Sharif, right? And especially when you locate this terrorism within the global Islamist sort of violence that multiple cities in the world have now experienced, especially when we had this graphic, and I'm not sure if we still have it, but we can bring up a very interesting thing where we actually had Nawaz Sharif eulogizing Burhan Wani, but Burhan Wani on tape is actually calling for a caliphate in Kashmir. He's calling for a caliphate globally. Do you think a large part of this was also an attempt to say, look at the content of our speech. We're not standing here talking about a terrorist who calls for a global jihad, who calls for a global caliphate. We're standing here talking about what the UN is meant for, the SDGs.
Right, and it's quite clear that the first half of her speech was really meant to draw that contrast out.
Yeah.
She spent it basically focusing not just on the SDGs, but on various ways in which India is working for the betterment of its own population, in stark contrast to Pakistan. And she mentioned Jan Dhan Yojana, she mentioned women, Swachh Bharat, a number of initiatives are underway. So in that sense, the first part of the speech was very important to show that contrast. The second part was really focused on tying terrorism linked to Pakistan to not just India. India is not the only victim, but she tied it to New York, where she's speaking, to places like Mogadishu, Brussels, Kabul, Dhaka. And so in some ways, I mean, I know that the term global war on terror is no longer that much in fashion, but Pakistan, what she was trying to project was that Pakistan is the epicenter of global terrorism. I mean, so many major terrorist attacks.
And yet this word we hear a lot these days, restraint, right? We've been hearing a lot of this word, restraint.
And
it was a restrained address.
You know, but it was also, I think, quite clear as well. I mean, the
no, it was not ambiguous.
It's not
ambiguous.
Restraint.
No. The two are different.
Yeah, but I think the sum total, I mean, the big conclusion to draw is that Pakistan is not just India's problem. You know, for much
Pakistan is the world's problem.
For much of the world, you know, another India-Pakistan spat is exactly what they expect. And at the UN, we sort of expect a call and response, almost Nawaz Sharif and then Sushma Swaraj responding to him. But I think the point she was trying to make was that this is not just India's problem. This is a global problem.
So let's open this up now. Emma Shalaruwali, I'll start with you. Then I'll go to Ambassador Dogra and Ashok. This was messaged partly for a global audience, partly to say this is a global fight. This isn't just a bilateral fight, you know, and don't treat this in your typical Western way as a nuclear flashpoint where Kashmir has to be discussed. I think that was very clear. She didn't even say the word Kashmir. I mean, I think that was significant, right? But what's the message to Pakistan? We're talking about the message to a domestic audience, to a Western audience, to a global stage. What is the message to Pakistan?
Well, actually, this message to Pakistan has been on for the last 30 years. We've been trying to communicate to them.
I know, but now, post-Uri.
Post-Uri, that look, this is part of our overall strategy. That, you know, we are taking it to the UN. The next step will be something else. The next step will be something else. And therefore, it is to highlight that we are not going to take this lying down. That's number one. Number two, I would have preferred if we had stuck to the region, because international terrorism is floating all over the world.
So you are actually saying that that was not a smart move?
No, it was a smart...
To make it the world, to make Pakistan the world's problem.
Pakistan is not the world's problem. Pakistan is a regional problem. And it would have been...
But clearly she was attempting to tell the world otherwise.
Yes.
And you don't agree with that?
No, I do agree in passing. But I certainly would have hoped that you would have bought out what's happening, you know, in Afghanistan, what's happening in Bangladesh, what was happening to a certain extent in Nepal. And fortunately, that should have been bought out, that Bangladesh and Afghanistan are today suffering the same fate as India is, thanks to Pakistan.
Let me just get to Chadri and then, I think that's an important point, that was it too broad stroke?
She specifically mentioned Afghanistan by name.
Yeah.
Of course, she mentioned Dhaka as a
target of terrorism,
and she mentioned the Afghan President who raised this issue of who is supporting terrorism, and this issue that terrorists don't own gun factories, terrorists don't own
who are their patrons?
Yeah. So obviously they are buying it from somewhere. They don't own a bank. So from where are they getting money? Obviously they are paying hard cash. They are not paying by credit card.
Yeah.
So where are they getting the money? How does this money get transferred from one place to another thing? I mean, these are all huge issues which are absolutely uncomfortable for countries like America, who is singularly responsible for the creation of ISIS.
But Mr. Chari, isn't there a contradiction here? Because in some ways our mission isolate Pakistan. It counts a great deal on the political capital we've invested in the United States, right? You have the Russians doing military exercises in Pakistan, with a degree of confusion, initially saying in POK, then saying not in POK.
Russians have clearly denied it. They have very clearly
but
denied it.
But they're still in Pakistan.
Neither in POK, nowhere else. They have clearly denied it.
I'm just saying that aren't we counting...
Anyway,
no, the question was something different. The question was, aren't we counting a lot on the Americans to actually drive our mission, isolate Pakistan, while actually being cynical about the Americans' own utilitarian attitude to Pakistan and therefore to India?
When
you're saying it's not going to happen.
When we are dealing with the USA, we should not forget one thing. Unlike Pakistan, USA is not centered. All the policies that is taken by the USA as a country does not emanate only from the White House.
Yeah.
They have a very large structured policy making process and an analytical approach towards all the issues. So when we were against US talking in terms of good terrorists and bad terrorists, more than our voice, there was a strong opposition from some of the US backed, the government owned institutions, and also some of the free thinking institutions from within the US, which said you cannot differentiate between good terrorists and bad terrorists. Any kind of terrorism is bad. But when it comes to allying with Pakistan, as far as the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan is concerned, if there is an over dependence of the US on Pakistan as far as the logistic supports that Pakistan can give to them is concerned, I think there is a large section within the Pentagon which thinks that we should not be very stern against Pakistan.
And that's the ambiguity of
unless we have an alternative space to
I'll come back to you both, Dhruv and Marshal Ahluwalia. I do have to go to Ambassador Dogra. Hussain Haqqani is also with us. Ambassador Dogra, go ahead.
Well, I think it was very interesting in many ways. For example, as you know very well, we have shied away from frontally attacking Pakistan and UN General Assembly debates. We've either not responded to them in the past or mentioned it in passing in a para or two. But this time, it was a direct attack on Pakistan. And as far as the audience is concerned, you're absolutely right, and so are the other panelists, that India and Pakistan were certainly the intended audience. But more than that, it was an emotional appeal to the world at large. And that is why, very cleverly, she has given a roll call of the cities which have been the in the list of terrorist attacks in the past 1 year. So I think overall her strategy was good. More than that, I was pleasantly surprised that she went directly against Pakistan, not in the sense that Maliha Lodi drafted speech read out by Nawaz Sharif was, because he talked of plebiscite, he talked of fact-finding mission, he talked of an international inquiry about so-called alleged human rights. She tackled all of them in a very subtle way. She said Kashmir is ours. That was a response to the plebiscite. She said terror is the biggest violator of human rights. That was a response to the fact-finding mission. So I think she did well in being direct. She did well in being strong. She did well in drawing in the others. But more than that, I wish if I was drafting the speech, I probably would have started by quoting David Cameron, who said 70% of all terrorist acts in the world can be traced back to Pakistan, and ended with something like Barack Obama, who told George Clooney in an interview that the only thing that keeps me awake at night is Pakistan. But I am different. I am no longer a diplomat. She is a chief diplomat of the country, and I think she did well.
But those are interesting things that you're saying we could have hammered it home more directly. In a sense, we could have hammered home the message to the global stage more directly. And I do want to correct myself. I said Kashmir was not named, but there was an iteration of it being an integral part of India. So I want to correct myself on that.
Very strong.
Ashok, before I get Hussain in, you know, there has been this talk, and you've written about this. You've said that people took away from the Prime Minister's speech what their own politics dictated. So, you know, there are the sort of the more hawkish people who said, oh, the Prime Minister gave a very strong rebuttal to Pakistan. There were those who said, oh, strategic restraint is back. You know, he was statesman-like. The same might happen with Sushma Swaraj's address. You know, there are those who are going to say it was very subtle, it was very restrained, it was actually not Pakistan-centric, we could have hit harder. You know, Ambassador Dogra has actually given examples. And there are those who will say, come on, it's the first time that Balochistan has actually been put on the stage of the UN General Assembly. So which way do you read it?
You know, see, it is a speech being made by India's chief diplomat or India's foreign minister at the UN. So there were 200 countries listening to it. Not all of them have concerns about terrorism or Pakistan. You have to place it in a broader context. India has many agendas. It's not, terrorism is a very important agenda, but it's not the only one. Therefore, unlike Nawaz Sharif, whose entire speech was unifocal and aimed at a Pakistani audience or frankly a Rawalpindi audience, she did not limit herself to just one issue. She did not address just Indians back home. She spoke about India's developmental challenges, linked them to the SDGs, and essentially pointed to India being a responsible power with many fish to fry. When it came to Pakistan, what Dhruv suggests is quite correct. This is part of a trend now of the Indian government identifying Pakistan as the root of many of the world's terrorist problems. I'm not suggesting every terrorist is a Pakistani, but whether the terrorist is trained in Pakistan or gets logistical support from Pakistan. She made a reference to the fact that terrorists don't have their own banks or their own arms factories. In a sense, she was debunking this idea of the non-state actor. She was saying there's no such thing as a non-state actor.
That's an important point.
A terrorist, whether a terrorist is a non-state actor or a state actor, he or she does get support from a state agency. He gets sanctuary from in a state. He gets arms from a state-backed army or agency.
Yeah.
He gets money from
Yeah.
the state. In the case of 9/11, for instance, money was traced back to ISI generals.
Yeah.
So, and that's just one example. There are several
Yeah.
examples.
Yeah.
So she was debunking this idea that Pakistan is not in control of its territory. All these non-state actors, we've been hearing this since 26/11. Non-state actors come, they do things to you. We have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah.
She was debunking that idea, and she was saying Pakistan has to take responsibility, and if it doesn't take responsibility, we have to make it take responsibility.
Okay, now
It's almost like.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, no,
if you have a computer, it says Intel inside. If you have terrorism, it now says Pakistan inside.
Yeah. There are reactions coming in from the Congress. We'll get Seshadri Chari to react to that. But I just want to get a sense from Hussain, who's long argued that Pakistan, his country, should start dismantling using terror as an extension of state policy. Hussain, Balochistan is now on the UN agenda in the way that Pakistan once almost customarily or perfunctorily even brought up Kashmir. But to me, there was a huge contrast, and I'm not saying this as an Indian journalist alone, but as an, even if you remove my nationality from it, Nawaz Sharif is talking about Burhan Wani. And I can play those tapes for you who calls for jihad. Sushma Swaraj is talking about global Islamist terror that is taking down city after city in the global capitals of the world. The contrast could not be more acute, I would imagine, from the world's point of view. How does it look from Washington to you?
Well, it was very clear that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was addressing a domestic audience. His speech was primarily about Kashmir. He also wanted to reassure the jihadi groups that Pakistan was not about to crack down on them. He also wanted to make the point that Burhan Wani represented some kind of an indigenous jihad in Kashmir, which is a very Pakistani perspective that most people around the world, including myself as a Pakistani, do not agree with. We realize that most of the jihad in Kashmir would fizzle away, even though we may not want that to happen, but it would happen without Pakistani, active Pakistani support. We know Hafiz Saeed operates out of Muridke, we know Jaish-e-Mohammed operates out of Bahawalpur. So all of those things were essentially things that he was saying. He knew that most of the people outside of Pakistan don't believe them. Sushma Swaraj's message, even though not at the prime ministerial level, was primarily directed at the international community. She would have been more credible if she had been a little more open about the human rights question in Kashmir, because when you say that human rights violations in Balochistan should be addressed, India perhaps needs to say, we don't mind if the international community has a peek inside and sees what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir.
But India would take the view, Hussain, that it's nobody's business but ours. And therefore, if there are problems, we'll resolve them internally. That has been India's consistent position.
But that's also Pakistan's perspective on Balochistan, because after all, we must remember that Balochistan is not a disputed territory in any sense of international law. So we must realize those issues. But the most important thing I have seen in the last few days is that the jingoism that we saw both on the Pakistani and the Indian side has now given way to a coherent strategy coming out of India, and possibly a strategy also coming out of Pakistan. They both now are trying to say, okay, let's see how much assets do we have globally. I think there India might actually have an advantage, and there will be more countries that will be affected by the calls to try and deal with terrorism. And I know one of your speakers just now said, and that's right, 70% of all terrorist attacks or personnel around the world have ended up having some Pakistani connection. They went through Pakistan to Afghanistan, they trained in Pakistan, they were radicalized in Pakistan, like the Chelsea would have been bomber recently. So all those things do affect the rest of the world. Now, what are Pakistan's advantages? Well, Pakistan's advantage all along has been the fact that it was at one time an ally of the West, and many people in the West, especially in the United States, are reluctant to quote-unquote lose an ally, even though they consider it a bad ally. The second advantage Pakistan has is that it's a nuclear-armed country, and the rest of the world wonders, how do you deal with a nuclear-armed country? I think that is where we will see the move in the next few days. This is now clearly a chess game in which there are many pieces on the table, perhaps more pieces for India than Pakistan. As a Pakistani, I would rather stop this chess game, as Prime Minister Modi said, and start worrying about poverty on both sides of the border.
Now, Hussain, you made a number of different points, but the most important of them, one is that, you know, say that if India is not going to talk about Kashmir, then Balochistan won't get much traction, according to you, by the same token on the global stage. But the other is your observation that you believe that tension is actually de-escalated. I'm not sure that I believe that. I know the speeches here have been very restrained.
I don't believe they have de-escalated.
Yeah.
I don't believe they have de-escalated. I think they have moved in a more rational direction now. Instead of television anchors calling for war and we'll show them and let's teach them a lesson, now we have strategists actually thinking about the next move. So we have people in Pakistan who, of course, there are many people in Pakistan who have had these crazy delusions. I've written several books on the subject. Who basically think, okay, well, we'll teach India a lesson through the same means.
So you're saying the conversation is more rational right now, more rational and not less driven by prime-time warriors.
Pakistan has more problems. Pakistan has more problems to contend with. India, of course, does not want to risk its economic growth as a result of some confrontation with Pakistan. Pakistan is just one of many issues for India. India is Pakistan's only issue, and so I think it is time, and by the way, Prime Minister Modi very smartly, and I think even Sushma Swaraj, tried to address the people of Pakistan.
Yes.
Look, the people of Pakistan are not completely irrelevant, even though the army calls all the shots. The people of Pakistan are already getting very restless. They do wonder why is it that our economy doesn't do as well.
That's a really important point. Let me come in there because I need to take last comments. Hussain, stay with us. You made a number of important points. I'll go around the table. Marshall, let's start with you.
Yeah, actually, I think, notwithstanding that we have to go through the process of trying to internationalize this proxy game that Pakistan is playing, it's very, very important to understand that we will have to deal with Pakistan primarily on our own.
Yeah.
We will get support, we may not get support.
Agree with you.
The chances are we may not get support.
Yeah.
I don't think somebody sitting in Sudan is going to worry about South Asia. But the question is, whatever strategy we develop, it must be totally pointed towards Pakistan and dealing with it ourselves.
Now, Mr. Chari, the Congress says disappointed by Sushma Swaraj's address, even steered shy of calling Pakistan a terror state. Strategic ambiguity was writ large. So what Hussain Haqqani sees as a sort of more rational conversation, less driven by TV jingoes, is seen by the opposition as a sign of ambivalence.
No, I don't know. I have not.
I mean, it's just coming in.
It's quite possible. I mean, I don't expect the Congress to jump over all the place and hail Sushma Swaraj's speech as one of the best made in the last 70 years.
So let's leave the party politics to one side.
I think maybe over a time of period, another 48 hours later, probably one by one, they will come out and say that, well, what she did was this good. She could have added this and so many other things. I am not getting into those details. But I think taking on Air Marshal's point, I think what is more important is, see, the whole important thing is the External Affairs Minister could have also chosen English as her language. She very calibrated, in a calibrated manner, she used Hindi as the language, so which is very obviously the first part of her speech, which obviously will be translated, will be read all over the world. And those translation, even if something is lost in the translation, is not going to really matter. But what is going to matter to the people of Pakistan? Remember, her speech was probably keenly followed in Pakistan.
Of course,
also.
It would be. And you're again reiterating Hussain Haqqani's point that this is also aimed now at the people of Pakistan.
The people of Pakistan. So the people of Pakistan in general would prefer to understand her speech in clear Hindi, which they are very comfortable.
Dhruv, add to that quickly.
Sure. I mean,
the Congress, just one more comment coming in. Why was she scared of calling a spade a spade? She should have asked for sanctions against Pakistan at this forum.
I can't speak to that, but I think the contours of the diplomatic approach being taken by India are now taking shape. And they really are threefold. One is making this position, showing Pakistan as a global challenge. One. Two, widening the set of issues, so bringing in Balochistan. If the Pakistan is going to talk about J&K, we bring in Balochistan. Third, splitting the people versus the regime of Pakistan. And I think this is now what we're seeing with the Prime Minister's speech a few days ago, and now Sushma Swaraj's speech at the UN. We're seeing the contours of this message getting out.
Okay, Hussain, we've also had talk here of maximizing the Indus water treaty, waters being explored. You say the conversation has become more rational. Can we expect the same sort of rational response in Pakistan? Is there any space left for rationalism? Because most people feel Nawaz Sharif missed that opportunity in his address.
Well, Pakistan, unfortunately, as you know, I've been saying for many years, has become a victim of its own national discourse. So the discourse there is about Kashmir without realizing that out of 193 heads of state, only one and foreign ministers who spoke at the UNGA, only one spoke about Kashmir. Even China did not directly address the question of Kashmir in their within the UN General Assembly. So what Pakistan was trying to do and has been trying to do for years is internationalizing the Kashmir dispute. Instead, what happens each time, and that's where Uri actually came to bite Pakistan back rather than advance its cause, was that it has internationalized discussion over terrorism and Pakistan's alleged role in it. Secondly, I think that, I'm a very strong supporter of upholding human rights all over Pakistan, including in our parts of Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan and Balochistan and Sindh and Punjab and Pakhtunkhwa, everywhere. But the fact remains that human rights becomes less of an issue internationally than terrorism. And that's a reality Pakistanis have to come to terms with. We must realize that we will not be able to internationalize Kashmir as long as there is a terrorism question. And there India's cards are stronger.
I do have to close. I'll give 20 seconds literally by the clock to both Ashoka and Ambassador Dogra. Ambassador Dogra?
Well, I think, as they say, a week is a long time in politics. So is it in Indo-Pak relations. Mr. Nawaz Sharif's speech was provocative. Mrs. Sushma Swaraj has been, if I may term it, clinically correct. But let's see what the next week holds.
Interesting contrast. Ashok, very quickly, please. Last word.
Just one point in response to something Hussain Haqqani said. I think India is raising Balochistan not just because of Pakistan, but also because of great concern in this country about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which ends in Balochistan, which ends in Gwadar, and creates a Chinese military facility, naval facility at our doorstep in the Indian Ocean. Therefore, Balochistan is going to be raised continuously till that project becomes diplomatically unviable for the Chinese. Now, that may never happen, but the Indian attempt to make it unviable will continue. So, I'm afraid we're going to hear much more Balochistan in the coming months.
We will have to leave it here. Thanking our panel. On the other side, we will be looking at the other big fault line in this debate. How far can you go with using water as a weapon? India has made it clear no abrogation of the Indus Water Treaty, but within the treaty, explore all opportunity to maximize it. How will Pakistan respond to that? Yashwant Sinha, who first proposed abrogating the treaty, is joining us live at 8. Wait for that. We'll be back in 4 minutes from now. Thank you.